We know that this emergency legislation is very much of a technical nature, and as we debate this, the ground is obviously shifting in the House of Commons, and hopefully we'll never have to use this legislation. I noted the Taoiseach's comments and opening this debate about the value of a united front across all of the political divide. And while I agree with him on that, and that most Irish people feel a sense of belonging to Europe, I think it's important to say that does not mean that we like or we all like or indeed respect the European institutions. That's where opinions diverge. During the height of the economic crisis, we saw intergovernmentalism driven by Germany and France at the core of decision-making in the European Union. The Union ceased to be a union of member states, and the small and more vulnerable countries learned a very hard lesson that eroded trust, not least here in Ireland, but had a lasting effect. That being said, the vast majority of people want to remain within that union. That does not mean that people would not like to see significant and quite fundamental reforms of the European Union, but that debate is for another day. Speaking some time after the Brexit debate, German philosopher Jürgen Habermas said, "The call to take back control," which was the label that played a role in the British campaign, is a symptom to be taken seriously. What really hit home with observers is the obvious irrationality, not just of the result, but of the entire campaign. He went on to say, like all symptoms, this feeling of the loss of control has a real core, the hollowing out of national democracies that, until now, have given citizens the right to co-determine important conditions of their social existence. The UK referendum provides vivid evidence about the keyword post-democracy. Obviously, the infrastructure without which there can be no sound public sphere and party competition has crumbled. After initial analysis, the media and opposing political parties failed to inform the populace about the relevant questions and elementary facts, let alone make differentiated arguments for and against opposing political views. End of quote. We can see that playing out now in the House of Commons in a very real way. The great irony is that the need to protect democracy following the referendum that played out on slogans and misinformation is being held up as the essence of democracy, while at the same time a much more informed populace may not get the opportunity to vote in an environment where they have a real understanding of the enormity of the decision and consequences for them as a people. That, I would argue, is a huge undermining of democracy rather than a protection of democracy. It is a real-life demonstration of the post-democracy era. The decision is not for us to make, but I hope there will be another vote. We have, we have reversed referenda, and it's most popular to point to European referenda. But I'm very glad that, for example, we had 2 referendums on divorce, for example, the second one being carried. And I think that the experience of both our Constitutional Convention and Citizens' Assembly have been extraordinarily useful as a precursor to referendum. We know asking the question in a referendum in the absence of information and possible outcomes is very problematic. We're perhaps more in a more unique situation than we perhaps fully realise as well. This is our second divorce with the United Kingdom. 1922, when the new Dáil was tasked with setting up an entire new state apparatus with the backdrop of the fallout from the treaty and a civil war about to erupt. Perhaps gives us some understanding of how difficult the early years were. And like 100 years ago, there is a unity of purpose in that the North voted to remain, and there is a united approach on the island of Ireland in relation to the commonality and the value of being members of the European Union. Reading the record of the Dáil in the early years of the state, it was very obvious that you couldn't anticipate, and I'm just thinking of that in the context of this legislation, you couldn't think of the things that possibly would be needed to do. It was a huge, kind of several different versions were needed, and institutions had to be created and recreated. It meant in some cases also that we inherited institutions. The nature of those institutions should reflect the culture they were devised within. Our legal, education, local government systems were all inherited and were developed within a culture that is not uniquely Irish. They were devised with the backdrop of people being subjects rather than citizens. Almost 100 years later, who could have envisaged that we would be, to some degree, having a regret about the division of Ireland and England, leaving the United Kingdom out of it, if you can do that. That's, it's like a strange feeling. One of the things that I've got to say is about the description, and it's within the legislation, of Northern Ireland being a third state. In this emergency legislation, which I hope is never used, that's how it's described. And I've asked myself why that description is so dispiriting. Like many, I want to see United Ireland, but I don't want to see a return to violence. That is reflected in the approach of the Good Friday Agreement. While a commitment to no hard border is paramount, the border of minds is a very serious concern. What has been so important in building and maintaining peace are the mundane and not very prominent mechanisms for engagement within Northern Ireland, but just as importantly in the North-South institutions. There are a small number of such formal institutions, but there have been new strands added underneath those that has broadened the reach and cooperation. If anything, that just shows the success and the bedding in of the peace process. And that border of minds is a real concern in that context. And while this legislation deals with very technical and practical issues, it is obvious that Brexit in any form will change the nature of those institutions, and that will be undermining to a greater or lesser extent. The success of the peace process has its greatest impact on the island of Ireland, but it's valued internationally. In a world where there is ongoing conflict, it is a pointer that it's possible to show other parts of the world where there is conflict that there can be a more hopeful and peaceful future. And it's important to have those examples to show. It's so essential that such examples can be pointed to, so any undermining of the process will have a much wider impact. Our joint membership of the European Union was central to that possibility. While ongoing, the conflict in Northern Ireland held both North and South back on so many fronts, but certainly economically. It is to our mutual benefit that both parts of the island thrive. But I would have heard it said early on when the referendum was carried that the big risk was the post-conflict that we would be moving that we should be moving into the second phase of normalisation, and Brexit will inhibit that for years. New diplomatic arrangements are also unlikely to replace the soft diplomacy with the European institutions, which the European institutions offered. Now, that's not possible to put into this kind of legislation, but there are things that are going to crop up irrespective of what Brexit, if any, happens. Yet, that is something that will have to be designed and put in place, but it will not offer the same informal opportunities. Building new institutions will need to offer or need to occur should the unthinkable happen and no deal Brexit happens. As I say, but Brexit in any form will require that. People are very fearful, and we're all hearing that, of something that could happen that is not of our making, and we don't have a lot of control over, and we can make as many efforts to deal with as we can, but until we see the shape of it, that is very difficult. And while we try and anticipate in the context of a no-deal Brexit how things will work out, how institutions adapt, and what are and what we're really doing here, Minister, is a series of educated guesses, and I think that that is something that I think we all acknowledge, and and we all have to work through. And it's certainly not a criticism, but I think it is the reality. Obviously, we're in a very fluid situation. I have no way of knowing how the votes in the House of Commons will go. We do know that there's a huge amount of trade with Britain. We do know that there's nearly 200,000 people employed directly in 5,000 or more small to medium companies in the small to medium sector, and when there's multipliers of that, you're probably talking closer to between 300 and 350,000. We do know that tariffs are a real concern. We do know that the currency value is a concern, and where this legislation is to deal with some very immediate things. It certainly gives us some understanding, or even thinking it out gives us some understanding that this is very much a tentative first step, and there's depending on how this plays out, obviously this is going to have to be revisited. We will of course be supporting this legislation and assisting in its speedy passage through the Dáil. Thank you.